Let's talk about the real reason why freight rates are so low, and it's not freight brokers that are to blame. Over the last few years, I have seen more and more cries of freight broker price gouging. And I want to show you all proof of why rates are so bad right now, but also how they've been bad before in the past. And this is a market, it will fluctuate. And I know what you're thinking, Bobby, don't tell me supply and demand. And cool, because supply and demand is actually not really the biggest problem. Supply and demand is not why carriers are going out of business. Still, it is a contributing factor, so let's just touch on it before we get into the main reason and how carriers can fix these things and be more successful and not go out of business. Currently, there are too many trucks on the road though, which means that there is not enough freight for every available trailer. When this happens, carriers go lower on their rates to make sure that they are one of the trucks to get a load. This is supply and demand. Since we're currently in a freight recession right now, this is normal, but it doesn't have to be this bad. That's the problem. The problem isn't that rates are low right now, it's that they're so low, incredibly low, and it can be fixed by understanding the problem. The real problem, and that is carriers. And I don't want you to think that I'm against carriers. I am not against carriers at all, but I am going to prove this. And before we go any further, I want to tell you where I lie in this because I'm the owner of a freight brokerage and I've been in this industry for over 10 years. And so you could think, okay, he's a freight broker. No wonder he's going to point the blame at carriers. That's just not the case. Again, I am not against carriers one bit. They are essential to us and everyone. What I am doing right now is putting to bed some of the misperceptions and shedding light on what the real problem is. So keep in mind, my company is currently looking to purchase trucks and trailers and get into the asset-based side of this business as well. So I am definitely not against carriers. So why are carriers the problem though? It's actually pretty simple. Okay, so hear me out with an open mind. Despite what the OOIDA and what you can hear from other drivers or even potentially your dispatcher, there are three parties to every brokered transaction. Brokered. You have the shipper, the broker, of course, and the carrier. And all three of those are influenced by supply and demand because of competition. So we saw rates soar over the last few years when there was more freight than there were trucks. Carriers made a ton of money and it was basically the freight boom, right? That's what we call it, is the freight boom. The reason for this wasn't actually that there was more freight than trucks though. The real reason is because shippers had to compete against other shippers to make sure that their product went out on one of the few trucks that were in the area. It's just competition. The competition is the same now for trucks, just in the opposite market. If you are a carrier, a dispatcher, a driver, or just someone who wants to point blame, do yourself a favor and just stop pointing blame at brokers. It is not brokers' fault. They do not dictate the market. They do not set the prices. And if you see a broker that is offering a rate that you don't like, just know they don't like it either. Matter of fact, out of the three parties in a brokered load, only one of them actually has the power to say no and impact whether a load moves or not. And that is the carriers. You have the power as carriers. Want to blame somebody? Blame a fellow carrier for being bad at business. And that is really what this all comes down to. And here's the worst part. One carrier alone cannot impact a market in the way that results in just such a dramatic decline like what we're seeing right now. It is many owner-operators that are a problem. And my suspicion is that it is mostly the ones that got into the business during the last couple of years. The ones that looked at the trucking industry and said, hey man, they're making a killing during this freight boom because there weren't enough trucks, and they decided to enter then. So here's proof that brokers specifically are not the reason that the rates are down and that carriers are struggling, and there are three of them. All right, starting off, number one. During DOT Blitz Week, the rates rise due to supply and demand. There are less trucks on the road, so the rates go up. That is proof for anyone who says supply and demand is at least not a contributing factor. Number two, on holiday weekends, the rates go up. But before you say, okay, that's supply and demand again, I have not actually seen this to be true, which is really interesting. So actually, at times, it is the opposite. I'm not talking about Thanksgiving or Christmas. I mean holidays such as Veterans Day, Martin Luther King Day, Memorial Day, Columbus Day, for example. All days where I have not seen a significant decrease of trucks on the road. In fact, I haven't even noticed a decrease at all for some of those holidays. Yet rates do increase. Now, there is something else that is interesting here. We do notice a fair amount of shippers closing on some of those holidays. So there is less freight to go around, an average amount of trucks still on the road, but despite the regular effect that supply and demand would have on the market, the rates instead increase for the weekend. Why? Unity. That's it. Carriers all just ask for more in unison simply because they're used to asking for more on those days every year, and it gets paid because it's got to move, because they asked for it. So who holds the power? Carriers are hurting each other, and I think it's just bad business and fear. It's a lot of fear. I honestly ask myself at times, do dispatchers booking drivers on these loads know that they're losing money on certain loads? And if so, does the owner-operator know? Are some of these new carriers just really bad at business and driving everyone down? That's my honest opinion. I think the trucking industry as a whole currently is broken. And there are too many carriers currently operating that are not qualified to run a business. I really think it's as simple as that. Unfortunately, they are dragging everyone down. And think about it. What other reason could there be at this point besides just bad business decisions? Besides not knowing how to be profitable? I mean, there's no carrier that would take a load for $1. They know better than that. So there are limits to what a carrier will take. And everyone's limit as a business owner should be calculated. And then the freight that they take should be at the bare minimum profitable. But I don't know if some of these carriers today actually know what their break-even cost is. I don't know if they actually know what it is per mile, per load, per day. It's unfortunate. I really don't think that they have a clue if they're making money on a certain load or not. But the main point here is simple, and it is fact. When carriers stand in unity on rates, they get approved. There is no denying that. That is fact. If no carrier will go under a certain amount of money, then that amount of money or more will be paid to move the load. And number 3, lastly, something that I think every carrier should know is that brokers prefer a tighter, higher paying market. We don't care when it's average, but when it's low, it's very bad for brokers and carriers alike. We do not like it at all. So when I hear carriers and the OOIDA say that brokers are the problem, I just can't help but to think that the OOIDA is uneducated in logistics. And that's a crazy thing to say, which is why it is so weird that despite me looking for any other possible reason, I just can't think of one. Besides maybe that they want brokers out completely, and maybe that's it, but I don't know. Other than that, I can't think of a single other reason, because brokers prefer a market that is better for a carrier. And just to be clear, not all drivers believe this broker nonsense. Okay, I have friends that are owner ops and friends that are company drivers, and they know better. Most of them have been doing this for a long time. They're not brand new in the game, and they know the ups and downs that just come with it. This is an industry. It is a market. It is going to fluctuate. There are going to be good times and there are going to be bad times. But some drivers and dispatchers buy into this anti-broker thing that the OOIDA has been leading the charge on. And that is a problem. It really is. That's ignoring fact because it feels better to point blame for the current situation, for these conditions, for these bad market rates, which unfortunately is something pretty normal for people to do. So that's my take. Now, how do we fix it? So recently there have been carrier strikes, which I think is pretty cool, honestly. Basically, they park their trucks for the day and they refuse to take freight. Why? Well, their hope is that this will combat low rates. But this proves that they do at least acknowledge and believe that supply and demand does have an influence in the market. And it's not just brokers demanding rates to be lower. Now you'll notice I say influence and not impact. That is how I believe it to be, influential. So carriers' decisions are impactful. Carriers, you have the power to set your price if you have unity. It's a fact. Stop going so low that you can't survive. But Bobby, there's not enough freight out there for all of our trucks. I know, but you have to know your numbers. Okay, stop losing money at least. Do your math. Figure out what you need on each load and use any resources that you have available, whether they're load boards, any of the technology that you have to find the loads that go to the areas that will pay you what you need. And it's not that easy. I know it's not. Okay. Just so we're clear on that. It's not easy. You're going up against so many people that are doing bad business right now, and they're not going to learn overnight. So they will probably fail as well. And honestly, as more and more of them fail, the more it actually does help the trucking companies that know what they're doing. And that sucks to say, but it's true. And it's also a great thing. I mean, what it is we have the freedom to compete, and those who are best at what they do will typically end up prospering. find the loads that you need. And lastly, let me just end it like this. If you are a person that opens up a business as a carrier with the plan to get your freight solely from brokers and then point the finger at brokers when you aren't happy with the loads that you're offered, you are to blame. FMCSA and OOIDA, I have one question for you. How can you possibly spend your time fighting to regulate an optional service? The OOIDA has said many times they do not need brokers, yet they ask you to regulate brokers. They also say they do not want any regulations, which is obviously very odd. So I'm just in shock. I mean, how in the world did anyone approve a law that supposedly fights against broker gouging, right? Which still has not been defined. What is gouging? So how is there a law to fight it? I don't know. But again, for an optional service, one more time, our government is trying to regulate an optional service. I want every carrier that is reliable, doing good business, especially right now in times of such fraud, to be successful. We need good carriers. But I also stick up for my fellow brokers as well, because I know how hard it is to build a successful book of business. And the FMCSA is putting the livelihood of many of these brokers in jeopardy by making them share customer information, and this is a problem. And so carriers, let me talk to you for a second. You may not know this, but about 75% of new brokers fail or quit or get fired within the very first year of trying to become a broker and trying to build that book of business. It is not easy. I've seen many dispatchers and drivers try to jump over to the broker side and become brokers, either to fail or succeed, but at least admit that it is extremely hard and much harder than they ever thought it was. With this law, brokers have no idea what the information would be used for or who it will be shared with, potentially other brokers even. That's absolutely damaging, and there's no way to control it with this law. And how does this solve the supposed issue of gouging? Will carriers backdoor brokers? If carriers do not want to use brokers, they don't have to, and more power to them. I don't think every carrier needs a broker. I honestly think carriers should have their own direct relationship with shippers and only utilize brokers as backups or backhauls. But they have to find, build, and earn those customers for themselves, not steal them, as I'm sure will happen. And I also want to say there's plenty of carriers that do this. They find their own customers. They work directly with shippers, and good for you. Awesome. Honestly, awesome job. And call a broker if you ever need a backhaul or if something falls through and you need, to be able to utilize a larger network of freight. That is what we are here for. But I think that if you are a carrier and you have those direct relationships first and you use brokers as a secondary resource, hats off to you. And to be fair, every carrier that I've actually spoken with about this new law has actually been against it. Or I shouldn't say against it, just impartial. They say they aren't really upset about it. It doesn't really matter to them. But they've been in the game a really long time. They know their expenses, they know their numbers, and they know what rates they can accept on each load, and they pass on freight that doesn't fit into that. Don't get me wrong, they're feeling the market constraints, but they save during those good times. They're smart, and they're good at what they do, and they know the market will get better soon. And finally, to all the drivers out there, this is not meant to put you down, not even in the slightest, I promise you. I wish you nothing but the absolute best, and I look forward to better conditions for all of us. I respect the job that you do and know the sacrifices that you make to be out on the road. It's not easy. And remember, brokers don't set rates. You set rates. Stick to your rates.